Hey guys, Mr. Cotter here. Today I want to talk a little bit about the final stage of westward expansion after the Civil War and its tragic effect upon the Native Americans of the Great Plains. The main takeaway I want you to have from this lesson is that while this story involves evil behavior and heartless violence, especially on the part of the U.S. government, those things were not the underlying reason for the destruction of the Plains Indian way of life. The underlying reason for this tragic story was the incompatibility between the Plains Indians' communal and nomadic way of life and the Euro-American system of private property and individual ownership of land. Only by utterly halting the flow of American settlers to the Great Plains could that area have been saved for the Native Americans. The first question I want to address on this topic is why Americans flocked in such great numbers to the West after the Civil War. The first answer is simple: to get rich quick. Between the 1850s and the 1870s, gold and silver deposits were found in present-day Nevada, Colorado, North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, Arizona, and New Mexico. Prospectors flocked to the site of the latest gold or silver discovery by the tens of thousands, turning uninhabited trading posts into massive boom towns almost overnight. Virginia City, Nevada, for example, grew from a town of a few hundred into a city of 30,000 in just a few months after silver was discovered there in 1859. Frenzied prospectors managed to pull $230 million worth of silver out of the ground in just a few years. As a result, Nevada attained statehood in 1864. Similar stories played out in Leadville, Colorado, the Black Hills of the Dakota Territory, and Tombstone, Arizona. The boomtowns that resulted were populated mostly by young men who had left their families back east in the hope of striking it rich quick. Many of these towns were relatively lawless due to the fact that huge population booms preceded any real government presence. These boomtowns were the birthplace of the Wild West as we know it. But when the local mines dried up, the towns often went empty, being known thereafter as ghost towns. The population surges due to the gold and silver discoveries led to the admission of several new states into the Union. Nevada in 1864, Colorado in 1876, and North Dakota, South Dakota, and Montana in 1889. Many of these states were the last refuges of the Plains Indians, who had been promised large tracts of land by the federal government to continue their traditional way of life. Needless to say, a gold-crazed prospector was unlikely to care whether the latest gold discovery was on Indian land or federal land. The other major reason for the settlement of the Great Plains was the abundance of cheap land being given away for free by the federal government. The 1862 Homestead Act was passed by Congress during the Civil War with the sole purpose of encouraging settlers to colonize the Great Plains. For just $10, you could settle on 160 acres of federal land, and after 5 years, the land was yours. The Homestead Act spurred tens of thousands of Easterners and immigrants to move west in the hope of becoming a prosperous, independent farmer. The timing was just right, too. New farming technology and techniques allowed settlers to succeed at wheat farming in areas that had previously been too arid to support large-scale agriculture. Additionally, the settlement efforts were aided by unusually high rainfall during the 1870s. By the 1880s, the U.S. was the world's leading exporter of wheat, thanks largely to the new settlers of the Great Plains. However, the 1880s brought significant hardships for the West's wheat farmers, as droughts killed successive wheat crops, and international competition pushed down wheat prices. Many farmers mortgaged their farms, meaning that they took out loans from banks and gave the banks the right to take the farm if they failed to pay back the loan. By 1900, banks had foreclosed on about 1/3 of the wheat farms in the Great Plains, turning those farmers into tenants rather than freeholders. The prospectors and farmers who flooded the Great Plains after the Civil War did not come into uninhabited territory. For the preceding 3 centuries, the Great Plains had been dominated by Native Americans whose way of life centered on hunting the massive buffalo herds that roamed the plains. The Plains Indians lived in bands of between 50 and 500 individuals. And while each tribe had its own hunting areas, these boundaries were fluid, and there was no concept of private ownership of land. In fact, their way of life depended upon being able to follow buffalo herds wherever they roamed. The Plains Indian worldview was deeply spiritual, with a focus on the balance of nature and a reverence for animal as well as human life. Even hunting with rifles on horseback, they did not kill more buffalo than could be replaced by the natural growth of the herd. They were no strangers to warfare, and Sioux warriors in times of desperation occasionally killed settlers in cold blood. But such acts of violence were part of a struggle for survival. They knew that the unyielding encroachment of white civilization spelled doom for their way of life. Beginning in the 1860s, conflicts between settlers and Indians increased as the white population of the West began to climb. In 1862, the Dakota of Minnesota under Chief Little Crow attacked settlers after the government failed to pay them as promised for relocating to a reservation. They were quickly defeated, however, and 307 were sentenced to death by a military commission. President Lincoln pardoned all but 38 of them after reviewing the evidence. Then, in 1864, a group of Colorado militiamen attacked and killed about 200 Cheyenne and Arapaho men, women, and children in an event known today as the Sand Creek Massacre. Just 2 years later, in Red Cloud's War of 1866 to 68, the Lakota successfully expelled the U.S. Army from a small portion of their territory in Montana, a success that would no doubt be short-lived. In the face of the recent spate of violence, in 1867, the federal government formed an Indian Peace Commission, which sought to make binding agreements between the government and Indian chiefs in the hope of stopping further conflict. But this project was doomed from the start, since chiefs did not have the kind of absolute authority to bind other Indians that the federal governments hoped they did, and the government couldn't actually guarantee that settlers would stay off Indian land. As the 1870s got underway, buffalo herds were getting wiped out by settlers who hunted them for sport at the encouragement of the army, which hoped to destroy the Indians' livelihood. Railroad companies, for their part, hired people to kill the buffalo herds so they wouldn't get in the way of train tracks. And after 1874, ranchers began crisscrossing the plains with barbed wire, further impeding the paths of buffalo and Indian alike. In the late 1870s, there were 2 more acts of Indian resistance that spelled the end of the Indian Wars. In 1876, prospectors overran the Black Hills of the Dakota Territory in search for gold, even though that area had been reserved for the Lakota people in a treaty with the federal government. When the Lakota refused to grant the land to the U.S. government, the army attempted to drive them out. At the Battle of Little Bighorn, the Lakota, under Chief Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, killed all but one of Colonel George Custer's 250 cavalrymen. Though it was a stunning victory, it encouraged the army to actually commit more troops to the effort, and the Lakota were soon defeated. Then, in 1877, Chief Joseph and the Nez Perce fought the U.S. Army in the hope of avoiding a forced relocation from Washington State to a reservation in Idaho. The forced removal was in violation of an 1855 treaty, and Chief Joseph was determined to keep his people free. However, the tribe surrendered in October 1877, since they were starving and freezing without access to the buffalo herds. Chief Joseph's struggle drew widespread sympathy in the United States, since the forced removal was so clearly in violation of the 1855 treaty, and since the Nez Perce fought so bravely against overwhelming odds. Nevertheless, the military defeat was total. With the Indians defeated militarily, the United States adopted a policy of forced assimilation, hoping that the Native Americans could be made to adopt Euro-American farming habits and culture. In 1887, Congress passed the Dawes Act, which divided Indian reservations into 160-acre farm allotments, which would be given to Native American families as private property for farming. If the Native American families remained on their allotment for 25 years, the act said, they would become American citizens. The policy proved to be a total failure, since most Native Americans had no interest in farming, and they decided to sell their land to white settlers instead. The government also outlawed most of their religious ceremonies. The famous Chief Sitting Bull was killed when soldiers tried to arrest him for participating in his tribe's ghost dance, a ritual that prayed for the return of the buffalo. Congress would not grant Indian citizenship until 1925, and would not restore ownership of the reservations to the tribe until 1934. The Plains Indian way of life could only survive so long as the buffalo continued to roam the plains, and so long as land continued to be regarded as a sacred and unownable resource. As the European regime of private property spread across the continent, and as European attitudes toward animals thinned the great buffalo herds, almost to extinction, there was no longer a possibility of a continued Plains Indian traditional life. Neither could the Indians have possibly resisted the American encroachment by force. Sedentary farming societies like ours produce enough food to provide for professional armies. In contrast, nomadic hunting societies like the Plains Indian have almost no specialization. In other words, everyone is a full-time hunter and only a soldier as needed. For this reason, in world history, hunter-gatherer societies have almost never successfully resisted the military might of agricultural societies. The story of the American West proved no different. Alright, thanks guys, and I'll be looking forward to hearing your questions in class tomorrow.